A row of warships sits in calm water under a bright island sky, steel so still it looks permanent, like the future has already been decided. But across the Pacific, another clock is louder than any gun. Fuel. Not patriotism, not ideology. Fuel, measured in tank levels, shipping schedules, and the hard math of how many weeks a navy can move before it becomes a museum. Japan's leaders had spent years expanding a war on the Asian mainland, and by late 1941, they faced a problem that could not be solved by courage. They were running out of the resource that made modern war possible. The prevailing assumption in Tokyo was that pressure could be managed, that time could be negotiated, that America would hesitate to fight far from home. Then the pressure tightened, the window narrowed, and negotiation began to feel less like a path and more like a trap. In that shrinking space, a decision formed that looked irrational to outsiders and inevitable to the men inside the room. Strike first, shock hard, and buy time, just long enough to seize what the empire needed and force a settlement. The mystery is not only why they chose it, but how they convinced themselves it could work, what they traded away to make it possible, and who paid first when the gamble failed to deliver what it promised. Join Rooms Where History as we trace the decision that made Pearl Harbor a turning point and ask what exactly that surprise bought and what it destroyed. To understand why Pearl Harbor became thinkable, you have to start earlier, when Japan's leadership committed to a widening war in China in 1937. The decision chain begins with momentum, early advances, then a conflict that refused to end cleanly. A long war meant long supply lines, long bills, and a constant need to prove progress at home while managing international condemnation abroad. Each year the costs rose, and each year retreat looked more dangerous, not only militarily, but politically. Inside Tokyo, the question hardened into a strategic dilemma. How do you sustain a continental war without being strangled by an economy that relies on imported oil and raw materials? That dependence was not theoretical. It was the foundation under every operational plan, every sortie schedule, every assumption about how fast the empire could expand, which meant the battlefield was never only China. It was also the world market, and the nations that could turn that market into a lever. That leverage grew as the international system hardened. American policy did not shift in one dramatic instant. It tightened, step by step, as Japan's actions in Asia convinced Washington that accommodation would reward expansion. Official statements and economic measures signaled a trend line. Fewer resources, more scrutiny, more friction. In Tokyo, the constraint stack became brutal. If Japan slowed down, it risked losing face and initiative. If it sped up, it risked provoking the very coalition that could cut off its lifelines. And the most dangerous constraint was time, because stockpiles shrink silently. A navy can look strong right up to the moment it cannot sail. So, the leadership faced two competing fears: the fear of war with the United States and the fear of paralysis without resources. The second fear, strategic strangulation without a shot fired, began to feel like the one they could not accept. On paper, Japan had options. The simplest was to de-escalate, reduce operations in China, accept diplomatic terms, and preserve access to trade. But simple is not the same as possible for leaders who have already built legitimacy on expansion. Another option was to hold position and gamble on negotiations, stall for months, keep talking, hope pressure loosens, and survive on reserves. A third option was the most aggressive: seize resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia, especially the Dutch East Indies, and build a defensive perimeter so wide and costly that the United States would eventually bargain. Each option paid something and bought something. De-escalation could preserve oil, but risked political collapse and strategic humiliation. Negotiation could preserve peace, but only if the other side believed Japan would actually change course. Seizure could solve resources, but would almost certainly trigger the war Japan feared. And the deeper problem was that every day spent deciding burned the very resource that made choosing possible. The pressure spike came in the summer of 1941, when American financial and trade measures effectively froze Japan's access to critical imports, especially oil. However leaders described it internally, the effect was the same. The fuel clock stopped being a background constraint and became the headline. In Tokyo, decision-makers could now calculate an end date, not for victory, but for mobility. And timing forced a choice. If Japan moved south to seize resources, it would collide with Western colonial holdings, and almost certainly with American power. If Japan did not move, the empire's capacity to fight would decay into dependence, first on desperate rationing, then on immobility, then on humiliation. The prevailing assumption that pressure could be endured while diplomacy worked began to crack. Because leverage only matters if you can wait, and Japan's leaders were increasingly convinced they could not. The fuel problem turned diplomacy into a race against depletion, and races create a temptation to solve time by creating shock. This is where the room matters. Japan's decision was not a single speech or a single man's impulse. It moved through an imperial decision cycle shaped by liaison conferences, military planning papers, and diplomatic cables, an ecosystem where the army, the navy, and the civilian leadership negotiated reality under pressure. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo became the face of a government tasked with turning constraints into action, while the Navy wrestled with a strategic truth it understood better than anyone. A long war against American industry was unwinnable. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had studied the United States and respected its capacity, argued in essence for a paradox. If war was inevitable, then only a stunning opening blow could create a window. Not to win outright, but to buy time for Japan to seize resources, fortify a perimeter, and make the price of reversal too high. It was a plan built on speed and psychology, and it required the leadership to believe that America's response could be shaped by shock. On paper, the Pearl Harbor concept targeted a specific mechanism: the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The bet was that disabling battleships and key facilities would delay American operations long enough for Japan to complete its southern campaign. That campaign had its own logic chain: Indochina as a staging area, Malaya and Singapore as gates, the Dutch East Indies as the resource prize, and the Philippines as a strategic threat to supply lines. Pearl Harbor was meant to remove the strongest immediate counterpunch, not to end the war in one day. But the mechanism had built-in risk. A surprise strike is a one-time asset. It burns secrecy, it burns moral ambiguity, and it creates unity in the target country. So the question inside Tokyo was not simply operational. Could aircraft reach the harbor? Could carriers remain undetected? Could pilots hit their marks? The question was strategic. Would the damage be enough to reshape American political will before American industry reshaped the battlefield? Here the story takes a breath, because it is easy to imagine war as momentum. In reality, momentum is engineered. Yamamoto's planners had to solve problems that made the strike feel close to impossible. Torpedoes in shallow harbor water, precise timing across ocean distances, radio silence that could not be broken, and pilots trained to hit a target most had never seen. This was not only military skill, it was organizational commitment under secrecy. And secrecy has a cost inside any system. Fewer people can challenge assumptions, fewer voices can argue for alternatives, and plans can start to feel real simply because so much effort has been invested in them. The more training succeeded, the more the decision felt validated, which is where the danger lives, because capability can masquerade as strategy. The plan could be executable and still be strategically disastrous. Diplomacy continued, and that is part of the tragedy. Even as the operational machine accelerated, negotiators in Washington and Tokyo worked within narrowing boundaries. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo managed a line that required two incompatible outcomes: relief from economic pressure without a retreat that the military considered unacceptable. In Washington, Secretary of State Cordell Hull and President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced the opposite constraint. If they eased pressure without concrete change, they would signal that expansion paid. So the options on the table grew thinner until the talks became less a search for agreement and more a test of credibility. For Japan, accepting terms that looked like surrender threatened internal stability. For the United States, accepting partial promises threatened the integrity of deterrence. That signal changed the math, but not because one side suddenly wanted war. It changed because both sides began to see the other's position as immovable, and immovable positions turn negotiation into a countdown. Back in Tokyo, the decision reached its moment of commitment. Imperial conferences functioned as a formal culmination, where civilian leadership, military leadership, and the authority of the emperor converged into an authorized direction. Emperor Hirohito's role is often simplified in popular memory, but the safer historical framing is this: the system produced a choice that was presented as necessary under constraints, and the highest level of the state sanctioned the path forward. Prime Minister Tojo became the political executor of a military logic, while naval leadership, including Admiral Osami Nagano, carried responsibility for a strike that could not be undone once launched. And that is the critical hinge. The moment orders are written for an attack, diplomacy changes meaning. Talking becomes cover. Time becomes a weapon. And the system adjusts, first in operational secrecy, then in messaging, then in the quiet acceptance that if diplomacy fails in the final days, it will not be rescued by last-minute compromise. The choice was now moving under its own momentum. Once the fleet sailed, the plan depended on silence and timing. Carriers and escorts moved across the North Pacific in a route designed to avoid detection, and every day at sea was both progress and risk. Because the moment the United States detected the strike force, the entire strategic concept collapsed. So operational discipline became absolute: radio silence, controlled logistics, strict scheduling. But even perfect secrecy could not control the most important variable: what would be in Pearl Harbor when the planes arrived. The plan assumed the Pacific Fleet would be concentrated and vulnerable. Yet naval power is not only ships, it is repair capacity, fuel storage, and above all, aircraft carriers. Assets that can survive a harbor strike if they are not present. Here, the gamble sharpened. Japan was not only betting on skill, it was betting on the enemy's routine. It was betting on what the enemy did not expect. And betting on routine is powerful, until routine changes. The morning of the attack delivered what surprise strikes are designed to deliver: confusion, fire, and a sudden reversal of perceived safety. Aircraft hit ships and facilities in rapid sequence, and the harbor became a scene of cascading failures, explosions, flooding, smoke, and sailors running toward damage they could not fully understand. From a purely tactical perspective, it was devastating. But strategy is not measured only in the first hour. It is measured in what the first hour makes politically inevitable. The strike did not merely destroy equipment, it collapsed the assumption that the United States could remain a distant factor, too expensive to challenge directly. It generated unity, urgency, and a clear narrative for American mobilization. And it created a moral clarity that stripped Japan of diplomatic ambiguity. The plan achieved shock, but shock is a fuel that burns fast. The immediate consequences moved faster than any fleet. President Roosevelt's administration framed the attack as an act that demanded response, and the political debate narrowed into a single direction: war. In Japan, leaders could claim a short-term operational success while facing the strategic reality they had tried to postpone. The United States would fight, and it would fight with time on its side. The Pacific became a connected battlefield. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, each operation now part of a single war economy. Here is a critical trade-off that often gets missed. By striking first, Japan removed uncertainty about American intent, but it also removed uncertainty about American mobilization. The United States did not need to be persuaded, it needed to be provoked into clarity. Pearl Harbor provided that clarity. And once clarity arrives, industrial capacity becomes destiny. Slow at first, then overwhelming. Second-order effects unfolded as the war expanded. Japan's southern operations could seize resources and territory, but holding them required shipping that became vulnerable to submarines and air power. The defensive perimeter strategy depended on time, yet time favored the side with deeper reserves and larger production. And the Pearl Harbor strike, while crippling battleships, did not eliminate the instruments that would dominate the Pacific: carriers, intelligence, and flexible logistics. This is where the earlier Navy's skepticism returns as tragic foresight. The men who feared a long war were now committed to one. The leadership had traded diplomatic space for operational initiative, but initiative cannot compensate forever for an unfavorable production balance. The gamble assumed the United States might negotiate after early losses. Instead, the losses became the reason not to negotiate. By the time the strategic horizon reached Midway, the logic chain had tightened into a trap. Early Japanese successes proved the operational concept could move fast, but they also expanded the perimeter that had to be defended. And defense is expensive in ships, pilots, fuel, and attention. The United States, meanwhile, could lose and still rebuild, an asymmetry that changes how risk is priced. The Pearl Harbor decision was supposed to create an opening in which Japan could set terms. Instead, it accelerated a system in which Japan's margin for error shrank with each month. This does not erase the constraints Tokyo faced in late 1941. It clarifies the nature of the trade-off. Japan chose a path that solved the immediate resource crisis only by creating a larger strategic crisis: war against an opponent whose strength grows with time. That is the signature of a desperate gamble. It buys motion now by mortgaging the future. So, what did the decision actually achieve in the short term? It bought Japan operational freedom in the opening phase, space to strike south, seize territory, and attempt to build a defensive belt before American power could fully arrive. It also delivered a psychological jolt that temporarily changed expectations across the Pacific. But what did it damage or risk? It unified the United States, erased diplomatic ambiguity, and converted an economic pressure campaign into total war. Most importantly, it traded away time, the very currency Japan needed, because it forced the United States to mobilize with singular purpose. The price was not only ships and lives in the harbor, the price was strategic. The decision locked Japan into a long war whose end conditions were structurally unfavorable. The deep lesson is not a moral slogan, it is a strategic principle. When leaders treat constraints as a countdown, they become vulnerable to solutions that feel decisive but widen the problem. A surprise strike can solve today by detonating tomorrow. And in rooms where history turns, the most dangerous plans are often the ones that are executable, dramatic, and emotionally satisfying, because they can hide the question that matters most. What happens if the other side refuses to negotiate? When you step back from the smoke and the headlines, Pearl Harbor reads like a case study in strategic trade-offs under pressure. Japan's leadership faced a real constraint stack: fuel insecurity, diplomatic isolation, and a war in China that had become politically difficult to unwind. The strike was designed to buy breathing room, long enough to seize resources in Southeast Asia and present the United States with an expensive reality to reverse. In the narrowest sense, it achieved that opening motion. But it also detonated the very outcome Japan could least afford: a long war against a state with deeper reserves, larger industry, and greater ability to absorb early blows. That is the price that often hides behind decisive action. Not only the visible cost of battle, but the invisible cost of escalation control, the loss of ambiguity, the collapse of diplomatic space, and the creation of unity in an opponent that might otherwise have remained divided. The lesson for any era is analytical, not moral. When a system runs on deadlines, decision-makers will be tempted by dramatic moves that appear to reset the clock. Sometimes those moves do the opposite. They start a larger clock that cannot be stopped. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps this channel reach more viewers who value calm, evidence-minded history. Subscribe for more Rooms Where History episodes, where we track the pressure, the constraints, the options on the table, the choice that won, and the consequences that followed, often both beneficial and harmful at once. And I would like to hear from you. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what you think mattered most in this decision: the fuel clock, the diplomatic breakdown, or the belief that shock could shape an opponent's will. Thank you for watching, and thank you for supporting serious documentary storytelling.